I tell you my story, which I have been suffering from since I was a little girl, and the reason is Mom. As for my father, it was a ring on my mother's finger that opened his mouth. No matter how you settled in us, in short, it had no role. From my awareness on the world, my brothers and I, who are older than me, and we showed the harem entering on a daily basis in our house, sitting in the hall so that they would enter when my mother, who was engaged in magic, and the harem were paying her large sums in order to get magic, and most of the people who found her were using the magic of harnessing the husband, and bring the beloved. Her magic was very powerful. Describing what Mom looks like, she dyes her hair and eyebrows bright yellow and cuts a boy. Milana and Audie were looking without a veil. When I got back from school on the bus, she was sitting in the garden and the students were surprised by her appearance and were afraid. I was just afraid to say it because she would hit us if we talked. She had a green-colored life that she loved and cared for more than us. The important thing is that every day at night, when we are in our rooms, especially at 3 o'clock in the morning, we hear knocking, songs and dancing in the hall. She was drunk in the room for us to see what. And one of the times my brother entered her in the room and saw her screaming and shaking with her soul, as if someone was standing in front of her. When I looked at my brother, her eyes were white without the black lens. I looked at him nervously. My brother got scared and started running and entered my room. Suddenly she walked in on us with a spoon and charcoal in a plate and she started burning my brother with his manhood. And she threatened him if he came in a second time by cutting him up and throwing him alive. When we sat down in the morning, we got my brother dead in his bed and the cause was cardiac arrest. The pain in my heart and the pain on my brothers are able to forget. With the days I became the show harem and men without features living with us at home. And more alone I was showing her and I got used to her. Her name was Free. After 12 o'clock, she turns and shows her true features. Once upon a time I was in the first high school. I woke up the clock. 2 at night I was my father, the bathroom. I saw her hideous form. She was completely naked and a hideous face. When she saw me she was running like an animal with her 4 legs, and disappeared. I grew up and I was content with what my mother had to do with people, splitting up couples and breaking up families. I continued on like this until I got to know one named Yasser, who was poor and he was married with 6 children and daughters. He was about 50 years old. This guy rented from my mom her second house and he was giving her rent. He became close to her until he thought she loved him, and it became what you take from the rent of the house. Imagine she was sharing a parental flag with him. The father of what is going on opens his throat with any word. The situation has evolved, and she began to sit with him in Diwanaya, aware of his wife and his dependents, and it was his daughters who gave them their base, shisha and Turkish coffee. His daughters and his family were satisfied with this situation, but their father forced them. As for his wife, he was stingy and forgiving of her husband cheating on her for the sake of what they pay rent to Mom. He helped her with her magic. And the years have passed and we are like this. Until my phone rang at 2 at night. And the caller Yasser was informing me that my mother had. And they took her to the hospital. I told my parents and we welcomed her. The doctor told us she went into a coma. A month later she died. What do I know about Sheno who became with her? Say Yasser. That day she was sitting with him in Diwanaya, and she was reading the cup to his daughter because his daughter had one suitor and his father, so my mother was showing her if the engagement was done or not. Suddenly doesn't she faint? After the death of my mother, the first thing that settled him, I asked Yasser and his dependents out of the house, and I moved and lived in it, because as much as I could, he continued to live in our house. I left him after I cleaned everything up and made him. As for my father, after the death of my mother, he got married and I became what I show, and he doesn't even ask about me, as if he doesn't have a daughter, and I only explained it on day of holding my Quran and then he left. Before I got engaged, I got hired with the fact that I needed a job. My mother left me a large fortune from her money that she collected from magic. At the job, my co-worker told me about an orphaned and lonely young man who is the same as me and told me that what you marry is about sanctity. And the boy is decent, and I actually agreed and married him, and when he and I live at home. But my mother's harem money worries me very much, even though I haven't spent any of them, and none of them are satisfied with my salary, thank God. I am afraid of God's punishment, and I am afraid to tell my husband about my mother and the source of her philosophy. And most importantly, my message to the harem is that they do not fear Allah, those who buy the world and lose the hereafter. What can you imagine is the amount of women who came to my mother, who bewitches her husband, who bewitches her husband's daughters or the daughters of her mother-in-law and disrupts their affairs from marriage and jobs, and the sister who bewitches her sister and nieces, and all the others and envy, and most of them are relatives. So pay attention, girls, always protect yourselves and do not leave any trace of you to anyone. Do not trust anyone, in short. And finally, we ask you to subscribe to my channel to watch the most unusual real stories in this field. Goodbye.